I want to welcome you again to another video drasha. This week's Torah portion is Naso, and this is a long portion with many different and interesting topics. And I'm going to discuss briefly a few of them. One of the first of these interesting topics to come up is the sota. The sota is a wife whose husband has come to suspect her of adultery. And so the Torah describes a ritual that was performed in order to try and resolve this conflict. It's a very complex issue. I can tell you that that in the Talmud there's an entire tractate, there's an entire volume of the Talmud that is devoted to this topic of the sota. It's an extremely complex and difficult, I'd say a challenging topic to understand and to understand this ritual. But there's one aspect of the ordeal that is described that I think highlights an important point that we can get our heads around. And that is the importance of Shlom Bayit, which literally means peace of the house or the household, but it really means peace between husband and wife, which is really an issue of paramount importance in Judaism. And we see something very unusual and I would say counterintuitive in the description of this ritual or this ordeal of the sota that we have in today's or this week's Torah portion. And that is that the Kohen, the priest, writes out these curses writes them out, including the divine name. And that's the important point I want to make here, including the divine name. And then he rubs them into, he crushes this into a container with water that the woman is then going to drink. But the significance is this: to erase the name of God is something that we would normally say is a tremendous desecration of God's name. Most people are very, very careful. I can tell you that even in English, I do not like writing the word God, G-O-D, if I know it's on some kind of a piece of paper or something that I'm going to hand out that might just be discarded. And that's in English. And truth is, it's not so clear whether it really is a problem in a language other than Hebrew. But certainly in Hebrew, to write any of God's names, you cannot discard that document. That's where the whole concept of Shemus comes from. The idea that old Sidurim and so on cannot simply be thrown away. If they contain the name of God, they cannot be discarded. You're not allowed to Xerox a Hebrew text that has the name of God on it and then to discard that. And so in this ritual where God's name is written and then it's rubbed into a container of water, this really shows a very dramatic concern for this issue of Shlom Bayit. Because I think what it tells us is that even the honor and respect that is due to God, to the divine name, can be put aside to some extent in order to bring about peace between husband and wife. And clearly that's what this ritual is meant to do, to restore a sense of Shlom Bayit, to restore a sense of peace in the home. And in order to do so, we can even do something that otherwise would be considered a desecration of God's name. So I think that tells us how important this is. And I'll give you another example, which you may find a little surprising. The real reason for lighting Shabbat candles is also Shlom Bayit. It's also peace in the household. Why? How does this work? Well, because if we didn't light candles certainly in the days before electricity, if they didn't light candles in the house, then on Friday night it would have been dark. And the sources say what would have happened is a person would be walking around his house in the dark. He'd walk into things, he'd stub his toe, so he'd get all upset, and then he'd start yelling at his wife. So the point of lighting Shabbos candles is so that you should have light on Friday night, so that people don't get into a bad mood, so that people are able to live in peace with one another. So we see, again, the importance of this concept and how it even plays a role in a ritual that we are very familiar with, lighting Shabbat candles. I'm going to skip over the next piece in the Torah portion because I want to come back to it at the later, but I'll tell you that the end of this week's Torah portion is the portion that we read during the holiday of Hanukkah. There is this idea of Christmas in July. Well, now we have Hanukkah in June. But why is this the reading for Hanukkah? Because the end of this week's Torah portion takes place at the dedication of the Mishkan, of the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary that was built in the wilderness and then was carried around from one place to another. So this was dedicated in today's Torah portion, and each of the heads of the tribes brought gifts for the dedication of the tabernacle. Well, of course, since there is a clear connection between the Mishkan, the tabernacle, and the temple in Jerusalem, so this is the portion that deals with the dedication of the tabernacle. And Hanukkah, of course, Hanukkah means dedication. So that involved the rededication of the temple after the Hasmoneans were able to reoccupy it and to purify it so that it could be used again for the worship of God. So this portion in our Torah portion this week, which talks about the gifts that were brought for the dedication of the Mishkan, that is the portion that is read during Hanukkah. Now, I want to point out one very small detail here. Each of the 12 tribes brings a gift. It's an interesting thing. We've discussed this in the past. They each bring exactly the same gift. And yet, the Torah, rather than simply stating what the gift was that each tribe brought and just saying, well, they all brought that. No, it goes through each one. And for each tribe, it says exactly what they brought, and it's the same. But here's the detail I wanted to get into this time, and that is that each of the 12 tribes is represented by a chieftain, by what's called a Nasi. We might say a prince, a leader, and the name of the leader is given. But each one is given the title, Nasi, except for the first. The first tribe is the tribe of Judah, and the leader who brings the gift is Nachshon ben Aminadav. But he's the only one of the 12 that is not given this title. So we might say, one might think, maybe he didn't deserve quite the honor that all the others did, right? That's why they all have a title and he doesn't have a title. The truth is the opposite. And sometimes I think we might say, for people who really are great, they don't need titles, right? And we actually have an excellent example of this in the rabbinic tradition, because the two greatest figures in rabbinic tradition, the two greatest figures, really the most significant halachic authorities quoted in the Mishnah and the Talmud, are Hillel and Shammai. Now notice what I just said, Hillel and Shammai. I didn't say Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai, because they are not called that. As a matter of fact, there is a Rabbi Hillel mentioned in the Talmud, but he's a much later and far less significant figure. The Hillel and Shammai of great fame, they're never given a title. They're simply called Hillel and Shammai. And so Nachshon ben Aminadab doesn't need a title. He was of such renown that he didn't require one. So now the question is, well, what was his great fame? Why was he so recognized among the others that he didn't need a title? Well, to answer this, we need to go back to the crossing of the sea. Now, I think sometimes we have the picture. As a matter of fact, I don't remember how it went in the movie. I don't remember in the Ten Commandments exactly how they portrayed it. When the Israelites got to the sea and the Egyptian army is coming up behind them, I think sometimes we think that the waters parted and then they just walked through on dry land. But that's not how the Midrash understands it, because the Midrash says that no, the waters were there. They had to go in before the waters split. Well, then, good question would be, well, who was the first guy to go in? You know who it was? Nachshon ben Aminadab, the leader, the guy who is the leader of the tribe of Judah, who brings the gift in today's portion. He was the first one to go in. And the significance of this is following. If the water would simply open up and you can walk through on dry land, okay, terrific, that's great. It's another thing to walk into the water and have the confidence, have the trust in God that the waters are going to split. But you go in when the waters are still there. And as a matter of fact, according to the Midrash, it says that he went in up to his neck before the waters parted. And so that's why everyone knew of the great fame of Nachshon ben Aminadab, the first Jew to go into the sea. Also in this week's Torah portion is another interesting and somewhat hard to get our heads around topic of the Nazir. A Nazir is a Nazirite. And there were two types of Nazirite. And actually this week's Haftarah portion is the story of the most famous Nazirite, the most famous Nazir, and that was Samson. But Samson was a Nazirite of a somewhat unusual type because he was designated already in his mother's womb as a Nazirite. So he was a Nazirite from before he was born until his dying day. Now, of course, we all know the story of Samson and the famous story of his great strength and how Delilah attempts to get out of him what's the source of his strength so that he can be defeated. And eventually, as we all know, the secret was his hair, and so she cuts off his hair, and he loses his great strength and is defeated. But I think the thing that we need to pay attention to here is it's not as if there was some magical power in Samson's hair. The significance of this is that to be a Nazirite, to be a Nazir, there were special laws, special restrictions that one had to follow. And one of those was to not cut your hair. And so the cutting of Samson's hair caused his demise because it meant that he broke his status of being a Nazirite from birth for his entire life. Now, in today's Torah portion, in the Torah, what is described is a person who takes a vow to become a Nazir, a Nazirite, for a certain period of time. One could become a Nazirite, let's say, for a few months. I think you could even become a Nazirite for and what it entailed was to take a vow and to then abide by certain special restrictions. The restrictions that applied to the temporary Nazirite were that they couldn't cut their hair, they couldn't drink wine or eat anything from the grapevine, and they could also not come into contact with a human corpse. That would cause defilement, and it would bring their Naziriteship to an immediate end. So this was a kind of a special status that a person could take on. And by the way, the Torah says specifically, both men and women could become Nazarites. But the point of taking on this special status was it meant more laws, more restrictions. And I think we learned something very important from this. You know, we have a situation in Judaism where there's a group of people called the Kohanes, the Kohanim, the priests, who in the time when the temple stood were really the leadership group of the people. They were the group within the Jewish population that carried out the rituals in the temple. And we've discussed in the past that the rituals in the temple were certainly the center of Jewish life. So the Kohanim, the priests, were at the very center of Jewish life in the temple in Jerusalem. And so the problem is, to become part of that leadership group was not open to everyone. Now, the Kohanim, the priests, they also had special laws that they had to abide by. They were in some ways similar to the laws of the Nazarite. They also could not come into contact with a human corpse. That's why to this day, a Kohen does not go into a cemetery, except for the burial of an immediate relative. But otherwise, a Kohen is not allowed to go into a cemetery or to a mortuary or into any building, really, that has a corpse in it. There are also special laws that govern whom a Kohen can marry, and so there are special restrictions. But the thing is, not everybody can become a Kohen. You can't say tomorrow, I'd like to have that job. I want to be a Kohen. No, you had to be born into a family descended from Aaron. That was the only way. And I think what the Nazarite institution was an attempt to have something similar. There were people who said, I want to have a greater level of holiness. I want to be able to feel a greater connection to God. And to do so, I take a vow that I commit to observe certain special restrictions. Now, one could say that in Judaism, the whole idea of the chosen people is, what were we chosen for? To get 613 commandments. We discussed, I think it was last week or the week before, we discussed the fact that all human beings have mitzvot, have commandments to live by. The fact of the matter is, for the vast majority of the world, they need to observe 7 commandments. And they're doing what they need to do. A Jew has the additional commitment. We have 613 commandments. That's the main thing about being part of the chosen people. Now, the difference is anyone can choose to become a Jew. A person can choose to become a Jew and say, I want to take on this obligation of observing these commandments. Again, as we said, a Kohen, nobody can choose to do that. But the Nazir, the Nazarite, was an opportunity to choose to abide by certain additional restrictions, certain additional mitzvot, in order to achieve an even greater level of holiness and connection to God. And so I think we learn from this the Jewish concept that being connected to God, living a life of holiness, does require adherence to the mitzvot. And in a sense, we would say, the more mitzvot you have to do, the closer that brings you to God. And therefore, this institution of the Nazarite teaches us that lesson, that there were people who actually wanted to do more, and they took on additional restrictions in order to achieve a higher level of holiness. Just also want to mention that in this week's Torah portion, we have the very famous blessing that Aaron and his descendants, again, the Kohanim, the priests, were told to use to bless the Jewish people. And this is, of course, the blessing that parents use to bless their children on Friday nights. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May the Lord cause his face to shine upon you and grant you peace. V'yasem lecha shalom. And certainly in these days, we can all use shalom. We can all use peace. I want to wish everyone a good Shabbos and stay safe.